Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me. This is Kathy. Today I'll be creating a card using the adorable Otters stamp set, the Slimline Waves die from Whimsy stamps, and a bunch of Distress Oxide inks to create a really fun background. To create that really cool background, all I did was apply the ink directly to my non-stick craft sheet, and then I spritzed it with a little bit of water. Once the ink bubbled up a little bit, I grabbed a piece of Canson watercolor cardstock cut to 4 inches by 9 inches, which is slightly larger than the die that I'll be using, and dipped it directly into the ink. I needed to add a little bit more water, so I spritzed it again and smooshed the cardstock back into the ink again. After I pressed the cardstock back into the ink the second time, I grabbed my heat tool so that I could dry that first layer of ink. One of the really cool properties of the Distress Oxide inks is that they can be layered on top of each other as long as you heat set them in between each layer. So I would dip it into the ink, heat set it with my heat tool, dab off some of the excess with a paper towel if I needed to, and then I would just dip it right back into the ink again. And you can start to see the layers building up where some of it looks a little bit splotchy, some areas are darker than others, and I just kept going until I was happy with the background that I had. I cleaned off my mat a little bit, then I decided to add a little bit more texture, so I squished the Blueprint sketch ink pad to my craft mat, sprayed a little bit of water on the ink, then picked it up with my paintbrush and splattered it on the background. Then I decided that I needed another color, so I squished the Mermaid Lagoon ink pad to my craft mat and repeated the process. Once I was done with that, I thought that I needed to have some sparkle, so I used my Perfect Pearls pigment powder in the color Perfect Pearl, added that to my craft mat, sprayed a little bit of water on the Perfect Pearls, and picked it up with my paintbrush and splattered that on the background as well. I kept adding splatters until I was happy with it, and then decided for just a tiny little bit more texture, I sprayed clean water in the palm of my hand and then flicked it over the card panel with my fingers, and then picked up the excess water with a paper towel. I heat set that most of the way, and then I set it aside to dry so that I could start working on the little otters. I stamped the otters onto a piece of Cougar Super Smooth cardstock using My Favorite Things Extreme Black Hybrid ink. I did stamp and color the otters 3 times, but I'm only going to show how I colored one because I colored all 3 of them the same way. I started out with E42 and colored in his face because I wanted it to be much lighter than the rest of his body, and by doing that, it was a reminder to myself to keep the darker colors away from that area. Next, I went in with E47 and added in the shadows where they would naturally be, like where his tail meets his body, underneath his arms, around the sides of his face, and the bottoms of his ears. And I did do a fairly thick layer of the E47 around his arms, but there's a reason for that, which we'll get to in just a moment. Next, I blended that out with E44. When I got up to his face, I made sure to bring the E44 right up next to the layer of E42 that I had laid down at the very beginning, just to make sure that the colors started to meet, but I didn't want to fill in that area with E44. Then I realized that I forgot to color in his arms, so I finished up his arms also with E44. Next, I blended all of those colors together with the E43, and I did go over the E42 on his face. We interrupt this program to let you all know that, you guys, I don't know what happened. I have gremlins in my computer and it ate some of the footage. On a good note, the only part that it ate was how I finished coloring the otter, and I finished that up by going over his face with E43, and I colored in his tummy with E43 and blended it out with E42. And now back to our regularly scheduled program. After I was done coloring all of the otters, I did fussy cut each of them out. And for these little guys, I did cut right up against the stamped line, and there's a reason for that. We'll get there pretty soon. And I do find it much easier to rotate the cardstock or turn the cardstock more than I turn the scissors. And you'll notice that when I get down here towards his tail, I leave that piece of cardstock in there. It's easier for me to cut most of it away and then go back in to cut out the little piece that I left in there, just because there's less surface area of cardstock to argue with my scissors. So that's why I'll tend to skip over those nooks and crannies until I get most of the excess cardstock cut off. After I had the otters completely cut out, I wanted to be able to tuck a little heart behind their hands. And in order to do that, I had to actually cut into the image. So what I did was I went in from the side and started to cut in up along the underside of his little arm, paw, arm, I don't know what they have, arms or paws. And that is why I had such a thick line with my darkest color while I was coloring. I figured if I didn't get the cut perfectly straight, it wouldn't matter because I had a pretty good guideline to use by doing a really, really dark shadow. And I did cut up around the elbow and around his little paws and then back around his paws so that I would be able to tuck the heart in there. And again, it's much easier to turn the scissors more than the cardstock, although once I got up to the top of his paws, I had to be pretty careful so that I didn't end up accidentally cutting him completely apart. After I had all of the little otters cut out and I had the arms cut away from the body, I used a black water-based brush tip marker to go around the edges of the whole image. And I even kind of pulled up the arms and the paws just so I could get that black ink in there so that none of the white showed. So it makes it less obvious where the actual cut lines were. Another thing that I did, and I did this off screen, was I used the solid heart stamp that's in the set, and I stamped that onto Cougar Super Smooth cardstock with Coral Berry ink from Altenew. I did fussy cut the hearts as well. And then to clean up the outer edges, I used my R42 Copic marker just to go around those white edges. And after that, I decided that the hearts needed to have some sparkle, so I went over them with my Wink of Stella glitter pen. And for the otters, the reason I used a water-based marker is because I did color them with Copics. Had I used a black Copic marker, there was a chance of the black ink bleeding into the colored image, and that was something that I did not want to happen. Anyway, after I was done adding the sparkle to the hearts, I added a little bit of liquid glue to the bottom and then just tucked the heart in behind the hands of the otter and then pressed down to make sure that the hearts would stay in place. After I had the hearts adhered to the little otters, it was time to start putting the card together. I ran the Slimline Waves Die through my Gemini Junior die cutting machine once with 80-pound Nina Solar White cardstock, and I adhered that to the front of a piece of blue cardstock that's cut just a smidgen bigger than that frame. Once I had that adhered in place, I adhered the inky background pieces into the appropriate spots, and I used liquid glue to do that. I placed an acrylic block on top of those pieces after I glued them into place. Because of all the water and all the ink, that cardstock did get a little bit warped, and the weight from the acrylic block helped flatten that out a bit. After I had all those pieces in place, I adhered the otters using liquid glue as well. And I made sure to add glue to the bottom of their elbows to make sure that they would stick really well, because that's where I had initially cut in so that I could tuck the heart behind their hands. And then I adhered that whole piece to my card base. For the card base, I used 80-pound Nina Solar White cardstock. I had cut it down to 7 inches by 8.5 inches, and I folded it in half along the 7-inch side. So the measurement of the folded card is 3.25 by 8.5. And then I decided that it needed to have a sentiment, so I stamped "I love you, a Otter," get it? A Otter, onto a little scrap piece of cardstock that I had off to the side. I used VersaFine Onyx Black ink to stamp the sentiment. Then I ran that through my Gemini Junior die cutting machine with a fishtail banner from My Favorite Things. I adhered the sentiment to the front of the card using my AdTech tape runner. The last step was to add a little bit of embellishment, so I used my Nuvo Jewel Drops in Sea Breeze and added a few dots here and there. And that's it. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.